Now my pleasure to welcome Al Rapaport, who joins us from Open Mind Zen. We're talking today about spiritual bypassing versus psychological bypassing. Please tell us more. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. It's always wonderful to be here. I was trying to think when you were doing the earlier introduction how many years I have been coming to this particular. It's been a decade, I'm sure, maybe long. I think longer, maybe. Maybe Larry would know, but yeah. And interestingly enough, there's a real connection in the U.S., probably other places too, but mainly in the U.S., between Zen practitioners and Unitarian churches, because believe it or not, we're more poor than you guys are. You guys all have buildings and many of us don't. So there's a lot of Zen groups that seem to meet in different parts of the country, including some of our affiliates in Unitarian spaces. And I've done many talks throughout the years in Gainesville, Melbourne, up in Rockledge, and also a few other parts of the country. So it is wonderful, that connection. And I can see why, because the wonderful inclusiveness and the notion of bringing all the parts of you, all the pieces, I think it said in that earlier offering that was made, bringing all the pieces of ourselves to whatever we're doing, in this case to a kind of worship in a certain sense. And my talk today is a topic that I've really been focusing on a lot lately, and it has to do with how we become complete within ourselves, how we feel complete within ourselves, how we become a complete human being. And one ancient Zen master called it the path of the true human being, the path of the true human being. So the term spiritual bypassing was coined by a man named John Wellwood, who wrote a book called Toward the Psychology of Awakening back in 2000, about 25 years ago. And he used it to indicate someone who had done a lot of spiritual practice, a lot of meditation, a lot of inner work, and yet they still were subject to a lot of neurotic behaviors at one point or another. And we see this a lot with people who are spiritual leaders in various religions, who all of a sudden we find out that they've been doing all kinds of wild and crazy stuff that's not in alignment with their own ethics, policies, and just general human ethics. There's a lot of instances of this, and it's not particular to any spiritual practice or religion. You know, you've seen it in yoga and Zen and Catholicism and other groups throughout the years. So what spiritual bypassing was meant to indicate is someone who'd worked on the spiritual side of things, the kind of what we call in Zen the big mind side, or the Buddha mind side, or you could call it the universal consciousness part of who we are, but had ignored some of the psychological material that they needed to work with on a more personal level. And so that always manifests later on if it's not worked with. And then the term psychological bypassing, which I had never heard before. I think I might have invented it because I did a Google search the other day after I first used this topic in a talk, and I couldn't find it anywhere on the internet, the notion of psychological bypassing. Spiritual bypassing, there's thousands of things that have been written about it since Wellwood coined the term 25 years ago. So psychological bypassing would be, conversely, working on our psychology and our neuroses and all that kind of thing that, believe it or not, all of us have a little bit of this. Except for me, I have a lot of it that I've had to work with over the years, but I'm sure none of you do. So, yeah, okay. So working on that, but not really experiencing that spacious kind of universal consciousness aspect of what it means to be human. And so in the system that I practice called Zen dialogue, which is based on a technique called voice dialogue, the man and woman who developed the voice dialogue system about 40 years ago were Gestalt therapists, and they came up with this modified version of Gestalt therapy they called voice dialogue. And the primary notion of this technique is that we're made up of many different parts. In other words, when we think of ourselves as being a particular being. But in this particular system, there are what are called primary parts of the self. In other words, the ones that we're aware of, the ones that we present to others or that others may recognize us as being. And then there's what are called disowned parts of the self. And these disowned parts of the self then, since they're not allowed out into the open, they kind of emerge in what you might call neurotic habit patterns. And so Hal Stone and Sidra Stone, who came up with this system, coined the term the aware ego. The aware ego is like the person who has integrated the psychological parts of the self and worked with it, and also the transcendental parts, if you want to use that term. I kind of like that term, transcendental. The parts of the self that are the spacious kind of, you could even say cosmic parts, or there's a lot of terms in many different spiritual practices and religions. There's different terms for this state of consciousness we can achieve when we kind of let go of all of the things that define us and move beyond that into love, essentially, as another one of the pieces you had earlier. It's like every time I come here, all the material you have always leads up to what I'm talking about, it seems like. It just perfectly dovetails into it. So then there's the question, so how do we do this? You know, how do we become aware enough that we're able to integrate all these different aspects of ourself? And that includes, by the way, some of the things that were noted earlier, our feelings, our emotions, whatever's arising, and bring that into the totality of who we are. Certainly the kind of space that you all have here that encourages that, I think is one wonderful way to begin to do that. But also on a personal level, I think it means we've got to work at it, essentially. Although it may not always feel like work, I think the word work is a little bit off in my view. Sometimes it does feel like work, though. If we've encountered something going on with us that's very pervasive and we know is a negative pattern that we need to work with, it can be very difficult to change a pattern that we've determined is highly negative. If it's something we've been doing for a long time. The longer we've been engaging in unaware activity, what we call unconscious or possibly subconscious. Unconscious means we're not aware of it at all consciously. Subconscious means we may be somewhat aware of it, but we don't know exactly what is motivating it. And so there's a tremendous energy to our habitual patterns, those habitual patterns that keep us thinking of ourselves and others in certain ways, thinking of our place within the universe in certain highly patterned ways. And so it's incumbent upon us as, if we're walking this path of the true human being, to look at how we can embrace all the parts of ourself, all the parts. That includes the parts we don't like, by the way. There's a lot of parts we don't like. And if we try and push them away, they just get stronger. The parts of ourself are kind of like people. And like if you push against someone, if you're always pushing someone into a corner and saying, I don't value you, you're not worthy or whatever, that person eventually can often explode and get extremely angry, and then you end up in conflict. We see that all the time when people are when people are disowned, when people are not viewed as being equal. So it's the same thing with different parts of ourself. If we're not giving all the parts of ourself an airing, if we're not allowing it to come up and look at it, it doesn't mean we have to indulge in it. In other words, if we're working with anger, it doesn't mean we have to go around being pissed off at everyone all the time. But if we admit that we have that as an issue, as I have had in my life, then the admission that it exists is a way of working with it and not bypassing the psychosomatic aspects of the anger which enable it to continue. So patterns, say, of being angry a lot continue if we don't get to the core of what we're actually angry about. And this is another thing that we often need to work with. Because sometimes something makes us angry, we say this thing makes us angry. So we're putting the responsibility for our anger on whatever is outside of ourselves. But where is the anger actually? You know, the anger is here. It's within my own body, within my own mind. So ultimately, there's a kind of responsibility we have to take for essentially not loving, for being angry, for being fearful, you know, for being anxious. It's not that there's anything wrong with those things and we don't want to suppress them, but we also realize at a certain point that we have to take responsibility for the patterns that have created that way of viewing other people and the world around us. Obviously, this is not required work for politicians. Unfortunately, it's not required work for parents, which is part of the problem, is anyone's allowed to run for political office. Anyone's allowed, you don't have to have a license for that. You do if you want to drive, but not if you're going to be president. And not if you're going to be a parent either. And so the neuroses of our parents and their parents, I noticed this recently because I visited my family, most of whom live out in California still, and saw several generations. And I noticed that in a way that I never had before, the intergenerational trauma that had continued from my father, who died a number of years ago. His father was really old, what we would call extremely violent and old school. And he wasn't violent himself, but you could see how that affected him, and it affected then his children because of the way he treated my mother. And then my mother, because of what happened with her in her childhood, was not able to express certain parts of herself. Wonderful person. She's still alive. She's almost 99. She lives just down the street over here, thankfully. Still lives on her own. But I can see this intergenerational trauma manifesting because there are parts of the self that have not been allowed to come out and then be worked with. Personally, I feel meditation is a real wonderful way to begin to get in touch with a lot of this material, and also to get in touch with the more spacious quality of the human mind, the spacious quality. In other words, when we're able to allow ourselves, allow all the thinking and the neurosis and the anxiety to drop away, and then what's left? Well, what's left is a spacious feeling of love, joy, creativity. The truly creative part of who we are will arise then naturally. And many instances in the work that I do, I encounter people that are living their lives for many years. Age has nothing to do with this, by the way. It's consciousness, not age. But in many instances, they're living their lives for many years, and they don't ever feel that they're being their true self. And that seems sad to me. It seems very sad to live our lives and then die and not having ever been our true self for whatever reason. And no one can tell you what your true self is. It's something that we all have to discover for ourselves. You can't rely on a partner, obviously not a politician, not a Zen teacher or a minister or anybody else. Certain people might inspire you, but it has to be done. We have to take responsibility for that also ourselves, is how do we get in touch with who we truly are and what our particular contribution is. And one of the ways we do that is by not bypassing either the spiritual part of who we are or the psychological part. You know, the individual, how we relate, how our relationships are. What's our relationship to our inner world, but also our outer world. Both have to mesh in order for us to really feel at peace and feel truly, truly whole. So there are many, many methods. I'll just end by saying that these days we have access to unbelievable amounts of information. But often that information is not all that valuable because we don't really pursue things to the depth and pursue our own inner inquiry to the depth that we need to in order to get clear about all this. But there's certainly an unbelievable number of resources around for clarifying our past habitual patterns, whether it be mindfulness or Zen or inner inquiry of 100 different kinds or 1,000 different kinds. That's a good way to start, is to begin to have a practice like that. And then that'll spread out into other parts of our life too. And at the same time, not ignoring the part of ourself that may need counseling in one form or another, may need assistance from a coach or a therapist or whatever. The first step is to realize that there are things we need to work on, that we need to work within ourselves. And then either we can do it and or we can get help from ones that we love and also maybe third parties that we're not closely involved with, because sometimes they can give us a perspective that the ones that we're very close to can't or won't give us. So I'll open it up for a little bit in case anyone has any questions about this or comments.